My friends, Mark Carney is selected as your next prime minister, and he appoints his cabinet. I'll tell you what I think is really going on, including based on his first travel plans. Very worrying. I want you to get the video version of this podcast because there's a few videos I want to show you of Carney today. To get the video version, go to rebelnewsplus.com. It's $8 a month. Which I know that might not sound like a lot of dough to you, but it really adds up for us. So please consider it. RebelNewsPlus.com, click subscribe. And not only do you get great content, but you support Rebel News because we don't take any money from the government. Tonight, Mark Carney is selected as your new prime minister, and you never even got to vote. It's March 14th, and this is the Ezra Levant Show.
Shame on you, you censorious thug.
Today, Mark Carney was sworn in as Canada's prime minister. He had a press conference. Rebel News was banned from the press conference. Shows you that the Carney prime ministership is off to the same start as the Trudeau one, censoring and silencing opponents. But here's some footage of Mark Carney talking. He was asked a question and he said, no, I don't want to talk about your questions. The news is standing behind me. No, that's not how it works, Mark. You can't say that what I tell you is the news. That's not really how it works in a democracy. The news is the news, and we get to ask whatever questions we want. One of them, which I think was on everyone's mind, is when will there be an election? And of course, to Mark Carney, who was selected, not elected, that question isn't particularly of concern. He said, well, for sure by November. Take a look.
Can I ask you what your plans are for the next few weeks? Are you going to be bringing back the House? Are you going to be calling an early election? And if so, when should Canadians expect to go to the polls?
Well, they certainly should expect to go to the polls before November. The news today is behind me. An exceptional group of individuals who are serving Canada, united, focused cabinet, focused on action, focused on the issues for Canadians. We are, as I said a moment ago, we will be going to take some decisions which directly meet some of the objectives I set out in my remarks, and we've been discussing.
It's so funny to joke about not having an election for months, having a prime minister that no one voted for, indeed that no one even knows about. But he did recognize that the media is very important here, and he sent a very blunt message to the CBC that if they do right by him, he'll do right by them. Take a look.
I'm complimenting the journalists from Radio Canada, and I would like to compliment the very existence of Radio Canada, and I'd like to reinforce that my government would be reinforcing. It goes back to Canadian identity, culture. This is away from the news, but the broader sense.
Yeah, that's pretty gross. Well, here's things that I think are news. I know Mark Carney might not think they're news, but I do. I think that we're dealing with what could be an illegitimate prime minister. I'm not saying it's impossible for someone who has not been elected to anything to be appointed PM. It's very irregular, but it's not illegal. But we don't know anything about the Liberal vote that made him leader. I suggest to you that it was, at the very least, questionable, if not fraudulent. We know that the Liberals boasted of having nearly 400,000 people register to vote, which is quite a lot. But fewer than about a third of them, 150,000, voted. 250,000 votes were rejected. On what basis? Who rejected them? Was there any scrutineering? How was this all done, given that it was online? So you had someone win with based on 150,000 votes out of 400,000. And remember that 14-year-old children could vote, foreign nationals could vote. Then we saw the fake debate. It was a love-in. They banned Ruby Dalla from coming, knowing she would ask some tricky questions. And of course, the vote count by district that showed laughable results that clearly aren't accurate. To say that Chrystia Freeland, even though we may not like her, to say she only got 188 votes for her in her own district, and Karina Gold only got 190 compared to massive numbers for Mark Carney. It's simply not believable. I think we have an illegitimate vote. And I think we have an illegitimate government for sure. To this day, Parliament has not been recalled. It's still prorogued. It has no popular support. It has no legal mandate. Mark Carney is a stranger. We don't even know where he lives, as in what country is he living in? We don't know anything about him. He certainly wasn't probed in any of the debates. And much of his media has either been very carefully selected with the state broadcaster, or he's gone down to the US to do it. I think he's a kind of Manchurian candidate. I know one thing's for sure. Doesn't care about Western Canada. Only 2 of his cabinet ministers are west of Ontario. And this has immediate impact. For example, canola tariffs by China. Massive 100% tariffs on the canola industry, which is enormous. It's a Canadian industry. It's a Western Canadian industry, and it's much bigger than, let's say, the electric vehicle battery industry in Ontario and Quebec. But that's actually what China was retaliating for. Trudeau and now Carney are banning Chinese-made electric cars from Canada. And in return, China is punishing Canadian canola. Not even a statement that I can see, let alone tariffs in return. But that's because it's Canadian voters, not Western Canadian voters. Worse than that, Western Canadian farmers. I don't think there's 1 in 20 Western Canadian farmers who would vote Liberal. I mean, you've got to be senile or deranged to be a Saskatchewan farmer voting for the Liberals. So Mark Carney doesn't care, and of course, the media party doesn't care. Stephen Guilbeault, though, the extremist environmentalist minister under Trudeau, is now in charge of Quebec. So good luck with any pipelines there. But I think the craziest news I've heard today is not the cabinet. It's pretty much predictable. It's just picking over the tired cabinet from Justin Trudeau. The craziest thing I heard today was that Mark Carney is immediately going to leave Canada to go on a lengthy trip to Europe. What? What? We're in the worst and strangest trade battle of our recent memory with the United States. And instead of going down to Washington or to Mar-a-Lago, he's off to Europe? How does that make sense? Well, here's how I think it could make sense. Remember who Mark Carney is. He hasn't been in Canada for decades. He was the Bank of Canada governor, it's true. But then he became the Bank of England governor. And then he became a UN climate activist. And then he became the chairman of Brookfield Asset Management, which is like a mini version of the globalist BlackRock. But I think what you really need to know about Mark Carney is to know that he was a World Economic Forum member of the board. He was a Klaus Schwab board member. So he doesn't think of the world in terms of Canada. He thinks of the world in terms of a globalist project run by the World Economic Forum. So of course he's going to Europe. To do what? My speculation is that Mark Carney is going deliberately to Europe, not to the United States, because he's actually going to build a World Economic Forum coalition, an anti-Trump, anti-American coalition. Remember, Mark Carney and Brookfield have deep ties with communist China, especially with Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. I think that Mark Carney, he's like an iceberg. We know about 1/7 that's above water, but most of it is below water. What has Mark Carney been doing in all these secretive meetings of the World Economic Forum, in his secretive meetings on behalf of the UN, on all of his projects? We don't really know, but what we do know is that he has made very high-level connections all around the world, transnational connections. And if anyone is the guy to build an anti-Trump global coalition, it's Mark Carney. I told you that when I went to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland in January of 2024, so not 2 months ago, but 14 months ago, that the 2 words on everyone's lips were Elon Musk and Donald Trump. They were terrified by Trump disrupting the world order, and they knew that Elon Musk would allow Trump to disrupt the world order, and that came true. The World Economic Forum Well, Trump is the antidote to them. He's like garlic to a vampire. And that hits home for Mark Carney, the consummate globalist man. I think actually more than anyone, other than perhaps George Soros' son Alex, who's doesn't really have the intellectual horsepower to do, he's more of a playboy. I think perhaps Mark Carney is the best positioned person in the world to put together an anti-Trump coalition. Not a politician in France or a politician in Estonia, or not someone small and small-minded, but someone who for decades has thought of himself as a citizen of the world and who went about doing schemes and plans behind the scenes under the radar. Remember, he has 3 passports. I think Mark Carney's actually just the guy to do it, by the way. I'm not saying he'll succeed, but I think that's his plan. He certainly has no plan to go to the United States. I think that Mark Carney is just as awful as Justin Trudeau, but he's smarter than Trudeau, he's harder working than Trudeau, and he is a much more powerful global network than Trudeau. I'm a little bit worried. Stay with us, more ahead. Well, the spat between Canada and the United States over tariffs affects the entire country, but really Alberta stands out in a number of ways. For one reason, the bulk of the trade surplus that Canada has with the United States is because we sell them so much oil. The second reason is that Alberta loves selling that oil, and Alberta is the most pro-American province in the country, by my assessment. And the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, is the most pro-American and most friendly to Trump. She even went down to the United States, Washington, D.C., for the inauguration. She's really worked the room down there when Justin Trudeau and other premiers like Doug Ford stank up the joint and engaged in counter threats and insults. Those may feel good, but I don't think they particularly work on Donald Trump. But here's the thing that's on my mind. Donald Trump loves yanking the chain of Justin Trudeau, and we'll see how he deals with Trudeau 2.0 Mark Carney. But one of the things that I think really upset Trudeau, and I think it upset other Canadians too, was the proposal by Donald Trump that Canada join the United States as what he called a cherished 51st state.
So we spend $200 billion a year subsidizing Canada. We don't have to do that. And frankly, the way that gets solved is Canada should honestly become our 51st state. We wouldn't have a northern border problem. We wouldn't have a tariff problem. They don't have much. They spend very little, as you know, the least of almost anybody on military. And we spend the most of anybody on military. We have a great military. I rebuilt the military during my first term. We're going to have to rebuild it a little bit again. Not that much, but we're going to have to rebuild it a little bit again. But Canada would be great as our cherished 51st state. You wouldn't have to worry about borders. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. And by the way, Canada is very highly taxed, and we're very low tax. We're considered a low tax nation because of me, because I cut the taxes so low. So the people of Canada would pay much less tax.
But just to be
It makes a lot of sense. And by the way, when you take away that artificial line that looks like it was done with a ruler, and that's what it was. Some guy sat there years ago and they said, "Rah." Well, when you take away that and you look at that beautiful formation of Canada and the United States, there is no place anywhere in the world that looks like that.
Now, the closest analogy I can find, and I've been using this a lot, is this would be like proposing marriage to someone who's already married. It's an indecent proposal. It's shocking, even immoral. It hurts the feelings. It seems outrageous. And I think a lot of people have taken it that way. But here's another extension of that metaphor. If you are in a marriage that is doomed, if you are in an abusive relationship and someone else comes up and say, "Hey, what are you doing with that loser? Come with me and we'll improve everything about your life, a better relationship." If you were considering a divorce anyways, and someone comes along and says, "We'll give you a much stronger economy, we'll give you real national defense, we'll buy all your oil, come and join a winning team," well, you might not find the proposal so indecent. And in fact, as certain polls have shown, young men, particularly in Western Canada, are quite open to the idea of becoming American. Danielle Smith, of course, is a Canadian patriot and has done what other Canadian premiers said, which is try and work out a deal. But what about the idea of not all of Canada joining the United States, but of Western separatism, and in particular, Alberta independence? It's an idea that comes and goes, I suppose, like a pendulum, depending on how abusive Ottawa gets towards the West. We saw that in the 70s and 80s, and then the Reform Party came along, and then Stephen Harper cooled things off when he was Prime Minister, and then Trudeau came along. What is the state of Alberta independence today? Joining us now to talk about this is our friend Keith Wilson. We know him as a lawyer, including a lawyer for Tamara Lich, but he's also a political fella. He joins us now via Skype from Alberta. Keith, great to see you again.
Good to see you, Ezra.
You know, I think that Alberta has overtaken Quebec as the part of Canada most interested in a post-Canadian future. How would you rate Alberta independence feelings or Alberta separatist feelings in March of 2025?
It's off the scales. I've never seen it higher. I mean, we have a history of in Alberta being frustrated and feeling that we're not getting a fair deal and that we're being taken advantage of. So we're not in a happy marriage with the rest of Canada. And there's more and more people thinking that at a minimum, that Alberta needs to become an independent sovereign country. And there's many as well that are finding great appeal in this offer from an attempt by US President Donald Trump to expand the territorial boundaries of the United States of America.
Now, I think that if you watch that interview with Marco Rubio and Catherine Herridge, Rubio says where this whole 51st state thing came from. Trump said what would happen if we had zero trade deficit. And Trudeau blurted out, well, that would be the end of Canada. And that's where Trump replied by saying, well, join as a 51st state. Here's Marco Rubio explaining it to Catherine Herridge. Basically, Rubio, the way he puts it is, it was Trudeau who came up with the unthinkable idea, and Trump just ran with it. Take a look.
President Trump has talked about expanding the U.S. footprint. In a hot mic moment, Canada's Prime Minister said that absorbing Canada is a real thing. Is it a real thing?
Look, you know how that came about. President's meeting with Trudeau, and Trudeau says, well, if you even out our trade relationship, then we will cease to exist as a country. At which point the president responded very logically, and that is, well, if you can't exist without cheating in trade, then you should become a state. That was his observation.
That's how it started.
It is how it started. And I think he's told the story publicly. And that's how all this began.
So I think Trump, who's a very good negotiator, immediately detected part of Trudeau's psyche that felt a little inferior or vulnerable, and he just kept going after it and going after it. But I actually don't think that Trump has much more, I don't think he's got serious plans to absorb Canada as he does with the Panama Canal and with Greenland even. I think Trump just wants, certain trade irritants removed. I genuinely think that's all he wants. Of course, he would take Canada if it was for offer, but I think it's just the rhetorical style that a lot of Canadians are not used to. We're not used to a brawling New York swaggery guy. That's just not our way. I don't know. I don't think Trump is perfectly serious. What do you think?
Well, I don't know, obviously. But so I'll speculate. If he's not, he could be made to be serious because Alberta has so much to offer the United States. There was a report that came out last week that significantly increased, when based on analysis, the actual size of our reserves of natural gas and oil. And it's astronomical. And we could become by our becoming part of the United States, Alberta that is, their strategic reserve. It's not only that, we have critical minerals. We have incredible large boreal forest for lumber. The majority of our cattle that are produced in Alberta are incredible high quality beef, go south into the United States as a lot of agricultural products. So we've got a lot to offer the United States, and it would be a pretty good acquisition for him if he could do it. Frankly, to be very candid, I've had to look at this very seriously with what I've been watching happen out of Ottawa and the crazy leftist extremist policies that we've seen under the Liberals, and I think are going to get even worse under Carney. And I'm looking at the cost of living, inflation, all of these other factors, and the economy generally. And my wife and I have had to ask ourselves, what would be better for our 4 children? What would give them a better, happier, more prosperous future? And the answer is obvious. It's not staying in Canada. It's either Alberta becoming an independent country, or Alberta joining in some way with the United States. I know that's controversial, but Alberta's been badly abused. We have so much to offer, and people are just done. They're just so fed up. And what Carney's going to, if he follows through on the things that he's written about in his books and his policies that he holds dear and near to his heart, net zero and all this other extremist nonsense that also his wife holds dear to her heart. She's just as much a zealot as he is. Guilbeault and Trudeau are going to look like a cakewalk. It's going to be Disneyland compared to what we're going to be facing. And I don't think Albertans will stand for it. What's really fascinating, Ezra, is you might want to ask me about what are the legal steps required if Alberta were to seek separation or join the United States? Because I think your listeners might be surprised at my answer.
I was coming to that because I was just wanting to note on Mark Carney. Today was his investiture as Prime Minister. He does not have a cabinet minister for Alberta. Not that there was a lot to choose from. But he has only 2 cabinet ministers west of Ontario. And he appointed Stephen Guilbeault, that maniac, in charge of Quebec. He's his Quebec political lieutenant, which basically confirms there will be no pipeline to the east. So I just wanted to say that before moving on to your next point. And my understanding, and I haven't studied this like it sounds like you have, but Quebec sort of was the icebreaker. It was the first to cut the path through the jungle on what are the laws surrounding secession. In the United States, secession, I think, is illegal. That was really what the Civil War was about. It was states saying, we're out of here, and the Union saying, no, you cannot leave. Slavery was a cause of the secession, but it was the secession. Lincoln himself said, I would fight this war even if not a single slave were freed. He wrote that in a very famous letter. I think in Canada, secession is not only completely lawful, but the Clarity Act and the Supreme Court have told us how to do it. Is that correct?
Yeah. So in 1998, there was a reference case that went to the Supreme Court of Canada because it looked like Quebec might want to succeed and become its own independent country. And if you don't have a legal mechanism, then you're only left with kinetic force, which you don't want to have. So the Supreme Court of Canada was asked to look at, is there a constitutional pathway for a province to leave Canada and become its own independent sovereign nation or join another nation? And the Supreme Court of Canada said yes. And they said what's required is a clear referendum, a referendum with a clear question, with a clear majority. And if a clear majority of the citizens vote in a referendum, a legally sanctioned referendum, to leave Canada and become their own sovereign, then it places each other province and First Nations, Aboriginal groups, and the federal government under a positive legal duty to enter into negotiations for the terms of that separation. Much in the same way that matrimonial property laws in every province require a divorcing couple. One can say, well, I'm not going to talk to her. Well, good luck with that, buddy, because you're going to have to. And then if not, there's a mechanism. So the same idea. So what's interesting, though, is that Alberta has gone further than any other province in putting all of the legal tools to implement that mechanism of separation in place, on the books, now, live, ready to go.
Really?
And I should add,
how? In what way have they done that?
Well, I missed the Clarity Act. So after the Supreme Court of Canada reference, the federal government brought in the Clarity Act, which basically codifies in statute the concepts that the Supreme Court of Canada laid out. So we have the Supreme Court of Canada decision saying, yes, there's a mechanism for provinces to separate. We have the Clarity Act affirming and providing additional mechanics and details to that. So Alberta, years ago, passed a law called the Referendum Act. And the Referendum Act allows the cabinet to issue an order in council calling for a referendum, has all the rules as to how the referendum will be held, how groups can fund and fundraise and advertise, election stuff. And then, in addition, a number of years ago, another statute was brought in called the Citizen Initiative Act. Right. So even if Premier Smith and her cabinet don't want to call for a referendum, but a sufficient number of Albertans do, they can, if we get over 600,000 people signing a petition, it will compel the cabinet to hold a referendum. So if enough citizens sign a petition within a 60-day time period, once the initiative starts, if they hit that threshold, then the cabinet has to call for a referendum, and Albertans get to vote on whether or not they want to form their own country. And then once Alberta is its own country, it can then negotiate with the United States on the terms of joining the Union, or Alberta could remain a sovereign.
I remember looking at those Alberta laws, and I felt that they were drafted to make it impossible to have 600,000 signatures, you say, in 60 days, in a province where the total number of voting adults is, maybe 3 million gross, or it's probably smaller than that. The number of people who vote in any given provincial election, I'm going to guess, is probably, I don't know, 1 million? Forgive me, I'm just spitballing.
Yeah,
here.
no, your numbers are accurate. They're just out of date.
Sure.
So it's 4.2 million.
Okay.
There's about 750,000 voters in rural Alberta.
Right.
I suspect that you could probably get 500,000 of them to sign the petition. And then you'd be looking to pick up a few 100,000 from the major urban centers out of a population of 4.2 million.
Well,
I think it's doable.
Thing. I mean, that it would be an enormous effort. I think that it all turns on one thing. Does Mark Carney win the election in 2025? If he does,
absolutely.
If he does, Alberta's out of here. And that's the thing. Donald Trump, maybe in his bones, he knew something was up. Canada does not want to join the United States, but Alberta sure might. And if Alberta goes, I think within a year, Saskatchewan would go. And then British Columbia, I don't know which half of that yin and yang. I mean, there's the eco-leftists, and then there's sort of the right-wingers in BC. But I think if Alberta went, Saskatchewan would go quickly. I think it all turns on if Carney wins. If Carney wins, all bets are off. If Pierre Poilievre wins again, it'll be like Stephen Harper, lowering the temperature. Things will be fine. And the raw inertia of it will make it impossible. I think that's what it comes down to. I think Mark Carney winning is an existential threat to Canada. Ironically, he'll claim that Trump is the existential threat to Canada. But Carney, and the way he operates and what he swears he will do, that would or could break up the country. And you know what? A year or two after Alberta leaves, if Alberta really were to join the United States, I think every entrepreneurial person in Canada would make their way to Alberta, because it would be just as Canadian as it is today in terms of its place and the people there, but it would have the freedom and would have the economy, would have, it would be every entrepreneurial, aspiring, prosperous young person would move to Alberta. You would have this huge magnet. And, I wonder if liberal Albertans would say, I'm leaving, and they would all go to Vancouver or something. I don't know, but it would be a fascinating thing. I think that's the stakes of the next election. Last word to you. Do you think there would be any other way this would go to a referendum? Do you think there would be any situation in which the government would call a referendum? I think any Alberta politician that would say we're going to have a referendum, because that would save the 600,000 name petition. I think any politician who would dare to say that would be absolutely destroyed by the establishment. They would be destroyed, pulverized, the deep state, all the parties, all the media, everything would destroy them. I think even if there are people in the Alberta government who in their hearts believe in separatism, I think that they would be too timid to say so publicly because they'd be destroyed as people. What do you think?
Well, I think what's interesting about the culture of Alberta, and I'm originally from Ontario. I spent 6 years of my life living in Vancouver. I've spent obviously the vast majority of my life here, but there's a unique culture in Alberta, and similar to Saskatchewan, that it's entrepreneurial, as you know. But what's happened in the last decade for sure is Albertans have come to an understanding of what we're worth, what the province is worth and what we're worth for our hard work. And we're tired of it. So if Poilievre gets elected and he tacks to the left to appease Central Canada or the Laurentians, that could be enough. We know the potential of this province. We know the potential wealth and prosperity that we can create and the opportunities for our children. And if any government's going to step in the way right now, people are impatient, they're fed up, they're frustrated. It's not necessarily the case that it would take a Carney win. A Carney win, oh boy, it's going to be fast. It's going to be fast, especially with Trump down there. He's going to see the opportunity and he's going to want to do a deal. I think it'll happen quick, or it has strong potential to. And also, we just don't know what's coming, right? I mean, look at the volatility, the whiplash of, whoa, what happened today? What happened tomorrow? We're in a fast-moving movie. And so who knows what's going to happen if Trump really starts to understand the potential enhancement and power and wealth that Alberta can contribute to the United States. And he really gets focused on making it happen. Who knows what events might transpire to make it more clear that this is a good choice for Albertans. So we're in interesting times.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. Well, Keith, thanks for giving us a briefing on it and a reminder of those different hurdles on the referendum side. I still worry that no referendum could ever get through. In my mind, those laws were placebos. They were brought in, if I'm not mistaken, by the Kenney government to placate Democratic-minded rural folks in particular, but I think it was a trick. I think the numbers are about 50% too high to make it possible. But the spirit is there, and who knows, maybe those numbers themselves could be amended. Great to catch up with you. I'm sure we'll talk more about this.
Thank you. Good to see you.
There you have it. Keith Wilson, King's Counsel, joining us via Skype. Stay with us. More ahead. Hello, my friends. Your letters to me on foreign aid funding to Bangladesh. Rumbler says, I hate the fact that monetary decisions and promises are being made with no discussion or debate on it. As far as I'm concerned, since the House is prorogued, all these are null and void. Oh, so much has been done when Parliament isn't in session. And I saw today that David Eby of British Columbia has introduced legislation, it's called Bill 7, that would allow him to essentially rule by fiat too. And of course, he's using Trump as the excuse for the emergency. Well, that's the thing about emergencies. If you give the government emergency powers to do things that they couldn't do in normal times, well, they're going to find an emergency everywhere, a COVID emergency, a climate emergency, a tariff emergency. You give governments emergency powers, they will declare emergencies. On the Court of Appeal approving the $290 million class action suit against the Freedom Convoy, Mommsen says, I didn't know nuisance was a crime. Why don't you do something about the illegal immigrants? Well, that's such an interesting point. Trouble is, in Canada, a lot of the nuisance is from legal immigrants. I mean, I think of the Hamas protesters in Toronto, but you're so right. They're absolutely a nuisance. If you compare the violence and the threats and the trespass and the mischief and the assault conducted by the pro-Hamas protesters to the peaceful, happy truckers, it's clear which one is the criminal enterprise. But police are very political in Canada these days, aren't they? Butterfly Katana says a counter civil suit from the Freedom Convoy members is called for. You know what? I don't know enough about that detail of the law. I mean, I don't know how they could sue Zexi Lee and Paul Champ. I think the remedy is if they win, they get some of their costs back from the bad guys. But I don't think you can sue them just for suing you. But again, I think more and more our courts are left-wing activists. I mean, 9 years of Justin Trudeau picking the appointees, that'll turn the court to the left. That's our show for today. Until next time, on behalf of all of us here at Rebel World Headquarters, to you at home, good night, and keep fighting for freedom.